So my name is SEBALEX. I'm just gonna check if there's any button behind me. I thought I'm pressing on something. My name is SEBALEX. I live in Barcelona. I'm originally from Lebanon. I'm an animal rights activist, and this is a workshop that I usually do when I'm traveling and if anybody reaches out to me. So first of all, I want to thank Sophie for organizing this. And yeah, I just want to share a couple of things before we start the workshop. So in the workshop, because we're talking about previous struggles, the main struggles I talk about are the women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement against the slave trade industry. So I want to make sure that everyone is aware that everything I'm going to share with you is knowledge that I have by doing my own research. So if anybody feels like adding anything or anybody feels that I said something that may be wrong, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me. I'm completely okay with that. Also keep in mind that I'm going to be talking and comparing the mindset of the oppressors of these struggles. I'm not at any point comparing the struggle of the victims. So I don't want anyone to feel offended if there's any comparisons being made. All the comparisons are about how the oppressors looked at the victims. So we're going to start with the women's rights movement in the UK, the suffragettes. And as I said, feel free to stop me, interrupt me if you have any questions, raise your hand. So in August 1832, the first time ever the suffrage was presented to the UK government, the parliament. And basically back then they were campaigning about for the right to vote, because women didn't have the right to vote yet. So it was mainly for equality and the right to vote, and they did that for decades. And every single time they did it, they were ignored, they were mocked by the government and even society. So there was a lot of pressure on them. And we're talking about times where the laws were extremely sexist. So I'm talking about adopting a woman over the age of 18 would put you 14 years in jail. But if she's under the age of 16, then it's just a misdemeanor because the age of 16 was consent. So if you like kidnap a little girl, she can't give consent, so it's just like something bad you did. But if it's someone who can give consent, then she's considered property, so then you would go to jail. That's how bad the laws were back then, and that's why women were actually passionately fighting for their rights. So for years they were completely ignored and completely mocked, and it wasn't until 1907, and 1918, so in 11 years, they took the battle to another level. And that level was civil disobedience. So that's when they started storming into the House of the Parliament, and they just did anything and everything they could to get media coverage to show people that they are serious and that the time of just signing petitions is over. They're going to use other tactics now. And in 1 week they got more press coverage than they did in 50 years before that, just because they decided to broaden their range of different types of activism. So they started organizing marches, they did protests. They had one protest that had 250,000 people taking over the streets of London, and that was the largest political rally ever. They used to break windows, so they did economical damage as well. They tied themselves to railings, and they used to throw rocks on the windows of shopping stores, and the rocks were tied to little letters that was mainly messages about women's rights. And they even went as far as doing arson attacks. So they burned down buildings that belonged to people in the parliament who were actively silencing the activists. And it wasn't until 1913, during the Derby, Emily Davison was a suffragette. It was all planned. She literally came out of the crowd, and she knew that it's going to have a massive effect. And she stood in front of the horse of the king. And what happened is, obviously, she got hit by the horse, and after that, she was taken to the hospital, and because of her injuries, she died. And that obviously shook the whole country, because you have to ask yourself, why would someone take this so seriously to stand in front of a horse and get hit and risk your life and eventually die? And that's when like the whole country was shaken, and they took the whole suffragette movement and the women's rights movement more seriously. And in 1918, it was during the war already, the First World War. Women over the age of 30 years old could start voting. Now, historians until now debate on what was the main reason why women got the right to vote over the age of 30. Some people say that it was thanks to the war, because what happened was a lot of men went to war, and all of a sudden women had the option to take roles in society that they never could before because all the men were there. So by taking those posts, they started proving themselves to society, like we can do exactly the same thing that you do if you're just given the option. So that was a major role, but most historians always say that another reason is that the government and the parliament and the police, because they were mostly occupied with what was going on a worldwide level, they did not want to face militancy anymore in national and as well by their own people. So we can see that the fact that they took it to the next level, the fact that they started doing arson attacks or just protests and everything, it pushed the struggle to the next level until the parliament gave them the right to vote. Now still, we're talking about women who were over the age of 30, and men could vote over the age of 21. It took them another 10 years, and it was in 1928 when all women over the age of 21 could vote. So this is very important because it just shows how, as a movement, the different tactics that they used actually helped achieve their goals. Now, if we are to look at the tactics, we can see that they used peaceful campaigns, they used lobbying and petitions, they did public meetings, they did leafleting, so educating people, chaining, arson, property damage, disruptions, demonstrations, and mainly their idea was phrased with the words deeds, not words. So we're not going to just talk anymore, we're going to get active, and that's what they wanted to do. When it comes to the mistakes they had is the existence of racism. And that's because when they were arguing why they have the right to vote, they used two arguments that were extremely destructive. The first one was, why can black men vote and white women not? And the second argument was, white women voting can help the presence of white power. So in a movement that actually, I know it's quite sad, but that's what they wanted to use. In a movement that actually fought for equality, they used arguments that were completely against equality. So they created racism within their own movement, which actually, thankfully, created some division in a constructive way, as in some people, I'm happy that that happened, because some people said this is not acceptable, so we will separate now, we will still fight for women's rights, but we will not use these racist arguments to achieve our goals. Now the counterattacks, and this is where we're going to start comparing what the industries do, the oppressors do. They did political campaigns, they did intimidation, and the intimidation that was done by the parliament mainly, it started with the manhood suffrage bill. So the suffragettes, whenever they wanted to present a bill, they called it the suffrage bill. Instead, the government ignored their suffrage bill and they introduced a manhood suffrage bill, so they switched the attention from women being oppressed to men are also oppressed, which I know, I'm pretty sure you can all imagine or remember a time when someone has posted something about feminism, let's say, and I really hope it doesn't trigger anyone in any way, but let's say someone posts something on Facebook about women getting raped, and as someone comments, well, men get raped too. Well, we know they do, but however, when you're talking about something, you don't have to take the attention and talk about another victim. And that's what the government did back then to intimidate women's rights activists. Another thing they did was obviously ignoring anti-suffragism. Anti-suffragism is the deep-rooted fear of women becoming masculinized simply by their entry into political life. So just the fact that they can vote scared people that they would be too masculine. And the last thing they did, this is just the beginning. When it comes to slavery, it gets worse. The last thing they did was they mocking them, which is kind of similar to intimidation, and here are two examples. Basically, they made postcards and other things with poems or little stories about how all these feminist and women's rights activists, they keep on complaining anything, but the houses they live in are made by men. So it's just the lowest of the low that you can get, to be honest, like to make fun of them for wanting to vote, basically, just because the house they live in is made by men, which actually is also another social construct that should change with time. So this is basically a real quick history of the suffragettes and women's rights movement in the UK. Now, when it comes to the abolitionist movement, it started in the late 1700s. It was a grassroots anti-slavery movement that started in England, and it was before the USA. And it was the first movement, one of the first movements, where the people who fought were not the direct victims. So, as you can see with the suffragettes, most of the fighters were women, and they were fighting because they were oppressed. When it comes to that abolitionist movement who fought against slavery, they were white English citizens. They were in no way any type of victim of slavery themselves. And it all started in a metal factory with 800 workers who understood that they had the power to end this oppression. 800 people, literally less than 10,000 people actually, who decided that you can change the world during the time where at least 3/4 of the population were a victim of slavery. And this is extremely powerful because slavery was all over the world. It's in South America, in India, in the Islamic world, in the United States, and doing so was considered to be insane because who would think now is, I mean the population has changed, so let's say instead of 800, let's say 5,000 people or 10,000 people actually come up to say, all right, we're going to change the world now. It's something that was so normalized back then. And that's why I want to share this amazing quote that says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Now, when it comes to what we can learn from the slave trade revolution against the slave trade industry, is the tactics that they used. They used boycotting, and that started with boycotting sugar. Because sugar came from, the industry of sugar was using a lot of slaves. They did pamphleting, education, a lot of civil disobedience, liberating slaves. In the USA itself, actually, there was the underground railroad by Harry Tubman, who used to use a specific road to free the slaves from south of the United States to the north, and then they would be freed. And that was obviously one of the tactics, always direct action, and they also used political campaign. So their mistake was unfortunately the presence of sexism. At one point during this struggle, 2 female activists flew from the United States to the UK on their own expense to join one of the, let's say, reunions or conferences, and they were not allowed entry because they were women. And again, just as we saw in the other struggle, within a struggle that fights for equality, women now this time, because of their gender, were oppressed by the fighters themselves. So we have to keep this in mind because we see it happening in a lot of struggles nowadays. And now let's talk about the counterattacks, which gets quite disgusting. They started with health. Now, I'm sure you're all thinking, how can owning slaves be good for you? What was the tactic that the industry used against? So as I said, they boycotted sugar, saying that sugar comes from slaves. And does the idea sound familiar to you when I say, oh, you can't stop eating sugar, you have to eat sugar because it's healthy for you? And that is exactly the same thing that now we're going to see this industry does with animals. And that's why it's kind of connected the way that the oppressors use their power. Another thing they always use is propaganda, obviously. Lobbying laws. At one point they passed a law that said if you liberate a slave, then you're a criminal. And that's something that we have nowadays. You know, if you walk into a farm, if you liberate an animal, you're judged as a terrorist. And that just shows the lobbying laws they have. Another thing was euphemism. This is also something that we see nowadays. We call it meat instead of flesh or any other animal product, but obviously back then what they did was they stopped using the word slave and they said assistant planters. Exactly. They also started giving out, basically they were doing a lot of welfareism campaigning when it comes to this. And they gave out 8,000 flyers in Cambridge, which was more of a leftist town, that talked about how each happy slave family had a snug little house and garden and plenty of pigs and poultry, which just sounds so beautiful, right? And this is where the welfareism got really to the next level, where it is exactly, if we compare it to what's happening nowadays, it's almost like they copy-pasted all the tactics from back then to right now. So welfarism, first of all, helped to delay the voting in Parliament about the abolition of the industry. They also designed bigger ships, and they tried to convince that now, with those bigger ships, when they're taking slaves from the continent of Africa, the slaves have more space to move in the ship. So obviously that's good for them, and it's nice because you're taking care of the slaves. And I'm going to quote now, and it says, they were using this argument. They said, if the weather is sultry and there appears the least perspiration upon their skins, when they come upon deck, there are 2 men attending with cloths to rub them perfectly dry, and another to give them a little cordial. They are then supplied with pipes and tobacco. They are amused with instruments of music peculiar to their own country. This was on their way to become slaves. Now, I want to talk about what we have in common with the anti-slave trade revolution and the animal liberation movement. So, first of all, the people fighting against are not directly oppressed. We, as humans, we're not directly oppressed like the animals. So it's the same with the first 800 workers that started fighting against the slave trade industry. They were not oppressed themselves. The industries make a lot of money every single year off of it. They have a lot of political power and lobbying. They are based on brainwashing and social conditioning. And our movement, just as the slave trade industry, the abolitionist movement, the consumer has the power. So the only reason slaves were there was because people were buying slaves because they were conditioned that buying slaves is okay. The same way that the only reason we buy animal products is because we live in a society that conditions us into buying animal products. Now the difference between the two movements is what's going to help us more. 99% of the world population is the direct consumer of the animal agriculture industry, while around 30% to 50% of the American citizens were slave owners depending on the states. Because in the southern states they were much more into slavery than in the north. So this is why we have to direct most of our activism into changing the consumers' habits. Even though they have a lot of lobbying, if we change at least 50, 60, 70% of the consumers, they have literally no other reason to continue doing this. They literally do it for money, and once they stop making money off it, they can continue much longer. Now the problem is, and another difference that we have, is that we ourselves are way too divided, and we have to start organizing better. And that's when I want to stop talking about the slave trade industry and the suffragettes and move to the animal rights movement, which is now most famous with infighting. Now, before we head into the subject of infighting within our movement and how it doesn't help us in any way, I want to talk about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Is there anyone here who doesn't know any of these two? You can raise your hand, don't be shy. I'm sure someone's lying. Alright, it's okay. So, I'm gonna give a short description, let's say, of who they are. Malcolm X was fighting for civil rights and against the racism, the systematic racism that existed in the American government. But he fought in a completely peaceful way. He believed in the power of nonviolence, no matter what the cost was. Malcolm X fought for the same thing. However, Malcolm X was seen as more militant because he said, unlike Martin Luther King, never turn your other cheek. He said, if somebody approaches you and they show any threat to you and they attack you, if you have to, kill them. While Martin Luther King said, let them never get as low as them, don't be as violent as them. Now, they both wanted the same thing, they both had the same goal, but their ways were so different. Like, it was black and white for them. Now, a lot of things that happened back then is actually like, you can find a lot of information, and in the beginning when I gave my first ever workshop on this subject, I actually said that they never publicly criticized each other. But then I did find out while doing more research that Malcolm X at one point did publicly make fun of Martin Luther King's ways. But he did that, as far as I'm aware, only once, and he changed right after because he realized that it doesn't really help the way, what they're doing. But he also didn't name Martin Luther King. He tried to just be more subtle, to not make it obvious, but he was not a big fan of Martin Luther King's ways of fighting against racism. Now, this is when we have to start thinking about what is infighting and what is constructive criticism. as you know, both of their ways was completely different. However, what a lot of people don't know is that Malcolm X actually reached out to Martin Luther King's wife, and he told her, after that comment that he made publicly, he told her, I know you probably think I'm against you, but keep in mind that this is how society works. And his idea and logic was, and later on Martin Luther King actually proved that actually they're both aware of that logic, is if both of them fought in the same way, it's one tactic and it could be ignored easily. However, what they did was Malcolm X used, let's say, a more violent, militant approach, which scared people from him, and they had no option but to go to Martin Luther King. So people had the option of either listening to Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, and that creates the choice of the illusion of choice, which is, let's say, if I say, do you want this water? You can say, no, I don't want to have it. But if I say, do you want the water or the phone? You kind of get tricked into thinking you have to choose one of them. And what they did is, if we both do it in different ways, and if Malcolm X acts more violent, then the people who are not going to listen to him, because he knows people are not going to like him, they're going to go to Martin Luther King, and he's actually inspired by Martin Luther King, and he doesn't mind that people go through him to achieve the abolition of racism. So this is how constructive criticism can work, and this is how different tactics can work. And it's a perfect example of how we could all realize that if someone does activism in one way that is not our perfect example of doing it, we don't have to get out of our way to bash them, either publicly or just spend too much energy on trying to change them, when we could just concentrate on what we're doing, because if their way doesn't work, the public is going to come to us, and vice versa. And we have to keep in mind that not every single way of activism can affect, it's not like a one-type-fits-all. Not everyone is going to go, let's say, vegan because they saw a cube, or because they saw a vigil, or because they had a disruption when they were eating. Every single person goes vegan in their own way, and every single person is different. So, unfortunately, Malcolm X was so convinced that infighting was wrong that it got him killed. So in February 1965, he was going to give a speech, and right before the speech, because there was infighting in the movement, there was a person he used to work with got jealous of his fame, and he went against him. And right before his speech, his closest friends told him, we have to search everyone coming into the hall, just in case somebody has weapons. And his answer was, I don't ever want a fellow black man to think that I doubt them. And then during that speech, a fellow black man shot him and killed him. So it shows how just a simple, small infighting could lead to people like Malcolm X, let's say, dying. The power that he had was so strong that it literally scared police officers. When police officers saw how just him saying one word could bring 1,000 people on the street instead in front of the hospital, they were afraid of him. And they somehow managed to make another fellow black man kill him. So the bullet that killed Malcolm X came from a person who could actually benefit from Malcolm X's presence because he was fighting racism himself. And this is where we have to be careful and think, how are we going to act when we don't like somebody's advocacy? What's the best way to reach out to them? What's the best way to talk to them? And what's the best way to actually affect the public? Because as long as the message is the same, if we're all talking about veganism, as long as you're not hurting anyone while you talk about it, why would I care? You know, because the message is the same, but the way you're delivering it is different. And that's what I think is a very powerful lesson to learn, no matter what struggle we're talking about, whether veganism or any other struggle. Now, with this idea, I'd like to talk about how we perceive our own movement, because I personally like positivity, but I also like more being realistic. I find a big, let's say, problem in being maybe too positive sometimes. So I want to talk a bit about that and see how the infighting, the mix of infighting with this idea that we are winning already, it actually make it worse for the animals and for the planet. So we always say this is the year for the animals, veganism is on the rise, it's the fastest growing social justice movement ever. You know, for example, there was a survey saying 7% of the UK population is vegan now. I saw all my friends sharing the article, victory, 7%, we're reaching the tipping point, etc., etc. No one actually, almost no one, actually looked into the survey and how it was done. The survey was based on environmental related people. So they asked environmentalists if they're vegan, and 7% of them said yes. And then they shared it as 7% of the UK population, because of the survey, is vegan now. So this is where positivity is actually working against us, because we thought that this is a victory, when actually, if 7% of environmentalists are vegan, we're not winning anything. Because with all the information that we have nowadays, with all the documentaries, all the facts and all the studies, we know that the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, water depletion, soil erosion, species extinction is caused by the animal agriculture industry, and still 7%, only 7% of environmentalists are vegan. We have to ask ourselves, is that winning? Now, I want to remind you all that I'm being realistic. From now on, when I'm going to share, I want to be realistic. I'm not being negative in any way. I just really believe that we can only win this and work for the best as long as we're looking at all the facts and all the numbers. So this is a global animal products consumption chart, different animals, different countries, etc. And we only see that animal consumption is on the rise. World population is also on the rise. And every single animal, except very, very few species, are actually on the rise. The very few species, I think 2 or 3 species of animals that we exploit are on decline. But all in all, we're consuming more animals than ever. Even though the vegan movement is growing, but we forget that while we grow bigger here, let's say, in Switzerland or in the UK or in the States, developing countries consume more and more animals every day. And that is very dangerous because most developing countries, they just think as meat and other animal products as luxury, right? So when they get to that level where they can spend money on these products, they do it. For example, China right now, usually China buys most of their pig products from Denmark because Denmark has more pigs than humans and they ship most of them to China. In Denmark, there's a company called Butina that prepares the gas chambers that are usually, I don't know if everybody knows, but most of the time, humane slaughter when it comes to pigs is putting them in gas chambers until they pass out and then they kill them. Now, Butina, that company in Denmark that makes gas chambers, is now building gas chambers in China. A population of 1.2 billion now has access to kill as many animals as they want because now they don't have to buy it and ship them all the way from Denmark, which is only going to result in more animals being killed. This is how the worldwide consumption is going right now. And again, we have to look, how is our movement going? This is a picture of 1990 in Washington, D.C., Animal Rights March. Up to 30,000 people in 1990 joined the Animal Rights March in Washington, D.C. 6 years later, in 1996, 3,000 people showed up. Last year, I couldn't even find an event link on Facebook. I'm sure there was something, maybe in a couple of thousands, but definitely not 30,000, which was in 1990. Which obviously makes us wonder, are we actually winning? Because if it was 30,000 back then, why is it not 100,000 now? It's been more than 20 years, it's like almost 30 years. So when it comes to 30,000 people attending, we see people, and I myself in the beginning, just getting excited for the march that happened in Israel last year. 30,000 people took over the streets. But was that really an animal rights march? People were there told me it was more of a animal lovers march. It was dogs and cats. A lot of people with just Israeli flags instead of animal liberation included messages and flags. When we look at all animal rights marches that happened in other cities, whether it's London or in LA or in New York, it was mostly actual animal rights march. All the banners, everything was veganism related. But in Israel, it was quite different. It was more of, as I said, people who love animals, people who care about animals, not vegans, went on the street, and we started getting like caught in that positivity again, 30,000 people taking over the street, we're changing the world, but most of them were not vegan. So that, in my opinion, again, is not a victory. Now, this picture is not for the people who are in the picture. Sophie scared me, she said they all lived on the corner. I googled laughing politicians, and that's why I used it. But I don't know who they are. This is how I see the animal agriculture industry when they hear about the vegan movement. Now, I know probably a lot of you are thinking, this is just depressing, Sunday afternoon, what is this guy talking about? But I think it's important that we see it, that we see the problems that we have, because if we just ignore these problems, we're not going to get anywhere. The fact that nobody knows that, I didn't even know until a few days ago that in 1990, 30,000 people walked the streets of Washington, D.C. These information are not shared, and if they're shared, then we can check and look into what we did wrong and what we can learn from what we did wrong, and try to see how we can fix it and how we can grow bigger and bigger. Now, we're more divided than ever, we're way too closed, we do not reach out to minorities, other movements and other communities, we ignore the lower class, we ignore other struggles, we stick to celebrating supermarkets having more vegan options, we even fight each other instead of the industry, we don't even know how to work in coalitions, we don't know how to work together. So we have to ask ourselves, is this winning? I think we have to stop acting like we are winning by inflating the numbers and start looking at things realistically, because inflating numbers is doing a disservice to ourselves. And also inflating numbers does not help animals. So in order to consider anything that we're doing is a victory, we should know the facts and numbers, we should fight realistically, and that will never be achieved if we get caught up in what I like to call delusional positivity. Because positivity is great, I hope everybody leaves today being more positive, but not delusional, not acting like we're already winning, because right now 1% of the world population is vegan, and 1% of that 1% are activists. So we're not even, as activists, 1% of the world population, and sociologists usually say you have to reach 11%, 13% to get to that tipping point, and that means we have to grow at least 100 times bigger than what we are now. Now, I'm going to talk about why this delusional positivity I think is so dangerous. I think we're completely ignoring certain factors. Let's look at a few environmental facts. About 97.5% of water on this planet is salt water, which means we can't drink it and we can't use it for crops. 2.5% of the Earth's water is fresh. Of that 2.5%, 69.5% is locked up in glaciers and snow and permafrost, 30% is deep beneath the ground, and 0.5% is surface and atmospheric water. That includes our bodies and the plants and everything. And we're running out of water. By 2025, 5.3 billion people will suffer from water shortages. Is this winning? Is being delusionally positive helping us? Between 20 and 40% of the planet's oxygen is produced by the rainforests. These are the lungs and the filtration system of the earth, and we're destroying it. Cattle grazing and clearing land to grow crops is responsible for the loss of 80% of rainforests worldwide, not only in the Amazon. And around the world, almost a third of all land, and not only rainforest, is becoming desertified. We can't use it anymore. This is not winning. Every year, 1.4 billion tons of solid animal waste is produced in the United States alone, which is 130 times more than one person's waste. All this waste obviously goes into our lakes, our rivers, our oceans. Around 3/4 of the fisheries out there are either fully exploited or overexploited, as we kill 2.7 trillion animals every single year. Now, a lot of people, and I myself, used to say we kill 80 billion animals every year. That's completely wrong. We kill 80 billion land animals every year. And in total, we kill 2.7 trillion animals when we count marine animals. And unless we think fish aren't animals, like non-vegans do, I don't see why we're not saying 2.7 trillion. Now, I've done my calculations. If I'm not mistaken, the 2.7 trillion number is not possible for the human mind to imagine. So I wanted to see how much it is per second, and the number was 73,000 animals per second. We usually say 2,000 animals per second because we only count land animals. So this is something that we have to be careful because it's kind of speciesist to not talk about marine animals when they're actually the ones who are exploited the most. So scientists expect fishless oceans by 2048, followed by a complete ecological collapse. Is this winning? I personally don't think it's winning, and I really don't think I'm being negative when I say it's not winning. So what I suggest, I'm not here to give the solutions. I'm just here to share the information that put me down in the beginning, and then made me realize, well, if I'm just being down and negative, it's not going to help. But if I share it with people, then more people know, and more people can be motivated, and more people can come up with ideas and techniques and just be more creative in what we're doing. So I suggest that the success of our movement is not to be calculated by how many vegan ice cream taps we have in the supermarkets, nor how many people are joining our marches, but how much the animal slaughter charts that you saw earlier are dropping. And as you can see, we don't have much time left for that. So if we have until 2048 and a bit later for a complete ecological collapse, that gives us around 20 years to change the world. And we all know that unless most of the world goes vegan, we don't really have any other option. And what that could lead to, complete ecological collapse leads to sea, water, the levels rising, which first of all is going to affect the poorest countries in the world, which creates a refugee crisis, climate refugees. They're going to have to move to other countries, and the way countries are functioning now, they're becoming more closed, the borders are getting more strict. So whether they're from those countries or other countries, it's not just because they're poor countries that they mean more, but the fact that that's going to create more problems than this refugee crisis just has to make us be more aware and more careful with what we're doing to organize better and see what are our chances to actually making it alive, basically. So let's learn from previous struggles. Let's learn to not oppress anyone when we are fighting against oppression ourselves. Let's learn to fight from our hearts and minds and remain realistic, neither delusionally positive nor completely negative. Let's learn to not let anyone divide us. Let's learn to accept and give constructive criticism and not fight each other. Let's learn to grow. Let's learn our weak points and strengthen them. Let's learn that in the fight of animal liberation, education is our strongest tool. And finally, let's learn that the battle of food liberation is a battle that will be achieved by a united movement that builds coalitions and understands that any and all means are necessary. I want to finish this with an amazing quote by Martin Luther King. It says, "Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war."